80s. At this point in the story, he's probably in his latter 80s, 85 plus, somewhere in there. And his thinking is that God has always been good to me. God has always been faithful. God has always preserved me. He deserves everything I got to give him, and I'm going to choose to go ahead and pray in spite of all this. So as we look at this story, some things that I hope we can gather from this is, what is it about Daniel that, in my estimation, and I hope yours, produced such superhuman courage and faith, if you will? And consequently, is there anything that I can learn from that? And can I take that learning and translate it into my own life, and I hope yours as well, to have anywhere close to the same kind of courage and faith that Daniel had? Like I said before, Daniel, at this point in his life, and all of his life, he was someone that, to the best of our knowledge, never tripped up. He lived a stellar life from the beginning of the book of Daniel, when he was about 15 or so, to this point, 85 plus years old. Now, you remember, he came to Babylon when he was about 15 years old, give or take, in around 605 BC. Now, in our last story last week, we found him in kind of a semi-retirement mode. They'd kind of forgotten about him. He's the old man, pushed out of the way. He still lives in Babylon, got an apartment somewhere in the city, but they don't pay much attention to him. At this point, things are a little bit different. At this point, Darius, the king of the Medes, has elevated him up. Okay, and so you got the king here, number one, at the top. Kings usually are that way. And underneath him, he's got 3 people that serve under him and administer the kingdom. Daniel is one of those 3. Furthermore, Daniel is so well thought of by the king, as everybody knows, that soon he's going to elevate Daniel to being King, Daniel, and then the other 2 or 3 people below him. But under Daniel, under these 3 people right now, you've got what they call 120 satraps. I don't know, governors, I don't know what you would call them in our lingo, but they were just 120 people that take more of the details of the government that's handled across this vast empire that they have. Now, as I said, the king is going to elevate him up very soon, and plus the fact that he's well thought of. But the people around him, these other 2 peers of his, the 120 probably under him, they don't like it much. And they are jealous of this old boy. They don't think much of him at all. Now, they don't really care one way or the other, I don't think, about his God. They're just secular guys doing their thing, and they just really don't care. But what they do care about is 2 things. One, he's a Jew, and therefore he's not one of us. And secondly, he values something above power and control that I've always appreciated, and that's what I'm after in this world. Those are the 2 things they don't like. Now, as they're looking at him, and they're looking at his whole life, they can't find anything wrong with him. He's always done it right. He's always been honest. He's been dependable. He's done his job well. He's done his administrative duties. Whatever he was given to do, he did well, and usually better than well to do it. But there is one thing. They tell themselves, they say, if there's anything we're going to trip this old boy up on, it's going to be his relationship with his God. That's from their point of view, that's his weakness, his Achilles tendon, if you will. So they come up with this idea, if you will. They appeal to the king, to his vanity, to his pride, and they say, King, good old buddy, you're a good guy, and we think a lot of you, and we think the whole nation thinks a lot of you. We think what you ought to do is declare 30 days of worship and prayer only given to you because you're a good guy. And furthermore, we'd like to see you, King Darius, put this into law. Now, this is the rule of law we're talking about here. This is, when it's down, it's down. It's binding on the king to the peasant. Everybody complies with the law. There is no breaking it. And the king, as you might imagine, thinks, not a bad idea. I can get into that. So that's what they do. They pass this law. Now, Daniel knows what's going on. He's not immune. He hears, but he doesn't say anything. He's going about his business. It's interesting that as you read the story there in chapter 6, that this little group, it would have been a relatively small group, I think, to have hatched this idea up. But when they present it to the king, as oftentimes happens in political or otherwise circles, they present it to the king of all of us. That being all means all levels of government think this is a good idea that we'll have these 30 days of worship. So that's the way the king hears it and decides to do it. Now, what does Daniel do? Well, Daniel, always in the past, has gone to his apartment 3 times a day, and he opens the window of his apartment that faces the east. He bows down and he prays. East being the direction of Jerusalem from where he was there in the city. And so he bows down and he prays for a few minutes and then goes back to his duties, whatever they are. So the day after, or I guess I should say the day of the passing of this law going into effect, he goes on and does the same thing he's always done. He goes home, opens his windows, gets down to pray. Lo and behold, his accusers show up in his apartment and say, got you. They've caught him. Obviously, there must have been an informant in Daniel's household among the servants that told him. But in any case, they show up and catch him. They turn around, run back to the king and say, King, by the way, you know this law you just passed? Well, Daniel, he's broken it right in your face. He's insulted you, king. Now, the king, to his credit, thought a lot of Daniel and didn't want to do anything, really. In fact, he's tried to change things, but he couldn't because it was law and it was a done deal. So the punishment here is death. So on the night of the execution of his punishment, which was going to be thrown into the lion's den, and these lions, these were lions, of course, full-grown lions, but these were lions that had the served purpose of executing capital punishment on individuals as deemed by the king. So they always kept them in a state of hungry. So they were always ready for a meal. So that night, the king paces his apartment. He is worn out. He's worried. He's concerned about Daniel. What does Daniel do the night of? He sleeps. What will be, will be. I've put my trust in my God, and that's what I'm going to do. And tomorrow I'll get thrown to the lions, and that'll be that. He doesn't know how it's going to turn out. Not at all at this point. Well, that's what happens. He gets thrown in the lion's den. That next day, the morning when the day breaks, the king hurries down there. They open up the pit, the cover in the ground, and they drag, and he hollers down, Daniel, are you alive? Has your God kept you alive? And Daniel says, I'm here. I'm okay. An angel came and shut the mouths of the lions, and now I've been preserved. Thank you, King, for asking. It's kind of my little paraphrase there. And they bring him out, and the king is so overjoyed. And Daniel continues telling him his story. I never did anything wrong, King. They did these. I had some accusers that led you into making a bad law. And then we see the king react by taking his accusers and their family, wives and kids, the whole bunch of them, however many it was, and throws them into the lion's den. There was probably no angel to protect those guys. I don't think they made it. But anyway, that brings us to our story here in the first point of God being trusted here. We read in chapter 6, verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber opened toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks to God before his God as he had done previously. Now, I think I'm safe in saying to all of you and myself as well, we would all say we trust God. And I know you would. You would agree with that statement, as I would. But the saying of it and the proving of it, well, there comes the rub. That's when it gets hard. Yes, God knows my heart and your heart as well. He knows the truth of the matter, but I don't necessarily know my own heart when set into a particular set of circumstances, and for sure, people around me do not know how I'm going to react in a particular set of circumstances of what's going to happen. And these circumstances, by the way, remember this, these were set in place by God. He allowed this whole thing to develop and materialize and progress all the way up to this crisis point we're at here. There's another story over in 1 Samuel 15 where we read about King Saul, where he had been commanded by God through Samuel to totally destroy the Amalekites, including all their possessions. But in the end, King Saul ends up sparing their king, King Agag, along with the best of their sheep and their calves and their oxen and so on, instead of following through with obedience. You see, when Saul was faced with obeying God, he declined and chose, in fact, to fatten his wallet instead by keeping the best sheep and everything that he had there. For his failure to obey, God removed his kingship from him, and we read later on, he ended up giving it to David, and David's kingdom was established, and that goes on from there. But the point is there, when he was called upon, he failed to obey. When he was called upon to prove his faith in God, that he had always said, I trust God, he was unable to follow through. But that's not the case with Daniel. Daniel knew exactly what his peers had done. And furthermore, he knew very well what the consequences were. He was under no misunderstanding of what was going to happen to him. You do not say no to the king in that day. You might get away with it in this day and time, but not then. You see, Daniel understood what the choice was. Do I obey God, or do I obey myself? Do I choose the safe route? Like I said when I started, he could have prayed in his heart. He could have just not prayed for the 30 days. He could have done several things there, just not worried about it, just forgot about it. But he didn't. He went ahead and stepped into the fire, if you will, and put himself in a position to be caught. And one way or the other, God was going to be proven. The issue was not the law, or even the fairness of the law, or even the behaviors of these accusers he had. The issue was, who do you trust? That was the issue for Daniel. You know, I've read before, back in a prior life when I used to work for TVA, that one of the keys to correct decision-making at anything you do in life is being able to correctly state the problem. Oftentimes we don't even do that. We don't state the problem correctly. But it's said that if you can state your problem correctly, you're almost there. You're 70, 80% there of being where you want to be to arrive at whatever that correct decision is. See, Daniel did that. Daniel correctly stated the problem that was, do I trust God or not? It wasn't, do I get eaten by lions, or do I obey the law or not obey the law, or what have you there. It was that. Now, a question we ought to have here is, we see Daniel at this point, like I said before, at 85-ish years old here. Now, did he arrive at this very courageous position in life suddenly? Did he just wake up that morning and decide, man, I'm going to be on fire for God? That'll be that. No. I submit to you that it started very early in his life. Now, when we look at the book of Daniel, he starts when he was age 15 or so with some pretty big deals even then. That's another sermon for another day. But I would suggest to you that Daniel's success today at 85 years old started when he was maybe in the womb, a year old, 5 years old, 10 years old, all along back in there. Let me read to you something here. This comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. This is what's called the Shema, that's recited even today, by the way, in Israel, and it's what all the grandparents and grandparents would have recited and taken very seriously. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." Now, I'm not going to try to get into all the things that's said there, other than to focus on the one point of parents and grandparents. I think that kind of catches a lot of us right there. These people, parents and grandparents, took this very seriously, and they spent every day talking to their kids one way or the other. As they went about their going to Walmart or whatever they were doing, they were busy teaching about God and His faithfulness and how you ought to be doing as a young man. That's the foundation Daniel had. That's the foundation that allowed him to make courageous positions. Now, he had to live up to it and act accordingly later in life through progressive testings, if you will, over the years. But he had a good foundation. You see, Daniel trusted God, and as a consequence, God was proven. See, that takes us to the next verse in chapter 6, verses 21 through 23. Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Now, consider this. This is getting a little bit tougher, but let me ask you another question. Would God have been equally proven to be faithful even if he had allowed the lions to kill Daniel? And secondly, do we have the assurance that when we obey God, that it will always turn out okay? Now, I'm going to answer those two questions with a yes and a yes, but I need to qualify them for you real quickly. You see, to answer the question, yes, of turning out okay, we have to define it from God's point of view, not the world's point of view. See, the world defines turning out okay as I get okay, I get to walking again, I get out of the trouble, I get hired at a new job, I get whatever I get. Things work out in a more prosperous manner than they were the day before. Things are just better. That's what the world means by turning out okay. But God's definition is differently. In God's terminology, turning out okay means He gets the glory. See, that changes everything about it. When you think about it from Him getting the glory. See, whether Daniel lives or dies is not really the point. It's about God getting the glory for the situation. Daniel had like I said before, Daniel had no assurance of how this thing was going to turn out. But he made his decision. This is what I'm going to do. And he followed through with that. You see, for Daniel, he wins either way. It's a life well lived for Daniel. If he lives, he lives. He carries on, going about his business, and the king, thinks of him well. He's elevated and all that stuff. Or he gets eaten by the lion, and he dies, and he's in heaven. Daniel doesn't lose either way. See, that's the position we're in as believers as the crisis and trials and problems and afflictions come to us in life, which, as you well know, happens to all of us. Things come and go. There's good days and there's bad days. Do we take the easy route, or do we take the right route? I mean, right now, as you well know, I'm busy with Wanda, and we go down during the week with my grandkids in Birmingham, and we spend depending on the schedule with the kids, we spend 3 or 4 days a week in Birmingham with my kids. Now, the 3-year-old is a 3-year-old, okay? That means he acts up and doesn't want to do what he's told and gets plumb stubborn, and we have to deal with that. Now, I've got two choices. I can be just as stubborn and enforce this is what we're going to do, and we deal with it accordingly, or I figure out some easy way, I bribe, I do things that make it easier to get on. Or I just say, okay, don't worry about it. I'll pick up the mess. I'll do this. And it's a whole lot easier and quicker, to be honest. But that's the decision. Do I do what's right, or do I do the easier route? Another question. Do I fudge on my income taxes? Nobody's watching. I can get away with it. Nobody probably ever know, and probably the odds are I wouldn't be caught by the government either. I mean, I'm just one guy of some, whatever, 300 million of us there are, whatever the number is. But we all face various crises. But rest assured of this, somebody's watching. Somebody is always watching. I mean, you go down to the Scottsboro Police Department right now, and you talk to them, they understand that well. Somebody is taking their picture with every traffic stop, with every engagement, everything they do, they are subject to being on the evening news that day. They know that. But again, somebody's watching. There's a question that is that I thought was good here. In the 1648, that's the year 1648, some preachers got together in London, England, and they wrote what's called the Westminster Confession of Faith. And from the Confession of Faith, they developed a larger and what they called a shorter catechism. All a catechism is a series of questions and answers to aid people to learn various theological truths. That's all it is. And the shorter catechism is intended to be good for children to be able to learn and grow up into. But anyway, question 1 of that document, of the shorter catechism, is, what is the chief end of man? And the answer given, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. I mean, these answers are fairly short, but that really gets to the point here of what Daniel was about. He was going to live and glorify God, whatever. Now, we know in this case that God had chosen to lengthen Daniel's life, get him out of the lion's pit and everything, and bring glory to Himself through the king's response. Again, all this crisis was orchestrated by God, which brings us to the last point of God being glorified. In chapter 6, verses 25 through 27, we read, "The King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for He is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So as a result of Daniel's event, his crisis, his decision, his point of decision, Daniel was saved, and the king, of course, and the court heard about it. But more importantly, in this declaration by the king, the world heard about it, which was pretty vast, of their kingdom. How did the world hear it? The king commanded that in all my royal dominion, the people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Now, I don't know if the king understood what all he was saying. I don't know about that, but I do know that he made the declaration, and at the end of the day, God got the glory. That's the point here of it all. There's a story here that you all are familiar with over in Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And this was very early in the period of the church's history. And you remember, people from all over the area had come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and there in all that, you saw the crucifixion. They saw the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and then following that, the Pentecost of Peter then preaching, and some 3,000 people were saved. Now, you had two groups in that there. You had the local people of Jerusalem that became believers, but then you had all the out-of-towners from wherever they were from that were in Jerusalem, and they didn't go home right then. They stayed in Jerusalem, and they continued to worship with the rest of this early new church. Well, as you would imagine, they've been in town, these out-of-town people, for over a month now, and their funds are getting a little short. So what's happening right now in this story of chapter 5 is the local people are coughing up the money, if you will, to feed and house and take care of the out-of-town people. And we read the story about how Barnabas sold some land, took all the proceeds from the land, and took it to the apostles and gave them to them and said, here, take this and distribute it to the people as you see fit, and feed them. And Barnabas got a lot of praise and a lot of traction, if you will. Of course, he didn't care about that, but he did. He was very much appreciated and looked up to. Well, everybody saw that, and everybody thought, I'd like to get a little bit of that acclaim, a little bit of that fame and appreciation. So we have the story of Ananias and Sapphira. So they also had some property. Ananias, he went and sold the property for X amount of dollars, whatever that was, but he took the money, whatever it was, and he decided to just keep back a little bit of the money for his own uses, which was fine. He could do that. But when he presented it to the church, to the apostles, he said, I sold my land, and this is what I got for it, and it's all yours. So he, in effect, had lied not only to the apostles and the church, but more importantly, he lied to the Holy Spirit. And that had immediate repercussions. He was struck dead, and then a little bit later his wife was too. But the point is, at the end of that, in verse 11 of chapter 5, we read that great fear came upon the whole church and upon all who heard these things. And then in verse 14 it says, believers were being added to the Lord every day, along. Again, God got the glory for the crisis that got orchestrated. Now, Ananias and Barnabas, they all made their decisions as they saw fit. And things materialized as they went along. But at the end of the day, it was about God getting the glory. Back to our story of Daniel. This secular king, King Darius, he was made to acknowledge four things. One, there is one God. Two, he's the God of these Hebrews, of this Daniel. Three, he is sovereign over all things, over all this creation. And fourthly, his kingdom will last forever. Now, Daniel faced a big test, no doubt about it. And how I would react or you would react, I can't tell you. I like to think I would react well, but that's pretty tough stuff, I'll admit. But in any case, Daniel remained true to his God, and God remained true to him. The point here for Daniel was, as it is for us today, we do the right thing today and let tomorrow take care of itself. I don't have any control over tomorrow, whether I live or die, but I do have some control over today, over the decisions I make. We often think of that we would love to see great things done for God, whether it's our church or ourselves or our family or whomever it might be. But the reality is, great things for God do not occur without great trials and afflictions that come along. They just do not happen in a vacuum. And you can expect that you will be faced with, if you want to be used greatly of God, you can expect to face things greatly. Just in our story we heard a little bit earlier from Brother Shandy about the Powell family that he's over in Tupelo. They've gone through a great trial. And they didn't know, the wife and the husband, they didn't know how things were going to turn out with that child or even her with her cancer that she was dealing with. But they chose to trust God. Yes, they worked with the doctors in the hospital, and they did all the things you're supposed to do. But at the end of the day, It was about God giving the glory. Doctors facilitate and they help and they do all kinds of great things. But doctors will tell you at the end of the day, they really don't heal anybody. God at the end of the day heals you, whether it's a common cold or a cancer or something else that happens. He's in charge of destiny. So that brings us to the point that I want to encourage you and myself as well. Trust God anew today, with today. And don't worry about tomorrow. And I know that's easier said than done. I understand that well. But we have to be about valuing God's glory more than my glory. And yes, you can expect to be tried. You will. Such a prayer invites being tried. Now, what do you do to be like Daniel, to kind of get ready for the trial? Well, you dive into the rock of your salvation, into Christ. You confess whatever your weakness is. You begin today trusting God with the little things, whatever they are, and let Him progress you along to the bigger trials if and when He chooses to put them before you. Remember, like in 1 Corinthians 10:13, God is faithful. He will not let you be tried beyond your ability and more importantly, His ability to support you. But you have to be trusting in Him. You have to be leaning on Him. And you have to be abiding in that fellowship with the Lord. That's how we live a good life that can be said to have been a life well lived at the end of the day. So that we all hear those good words of well done, good and faithful servant. I'm sure Daniel heard that whenever he breathed his last breath. And I would wish the same for all of us. Let me have a closing prayer. Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you for the truthfulness. Thank you that you are faithful, that you are sovereign, that you take care of all the details of life. And we thank you that you are in control and will not let anything greater than you've deemed to come into our life to happen and cause us to fail. I ask, Lord, that you will strengthen each of us now in this moment and more importantly in the moments to come throughout the remaining years of our life, whatever they are, that as the trials and the afflictions come, as they will, that we stand tall for you, that we choose that we're going to glorify you, whatever tomorrow holds. I thank you that you're faithful, and I thank you that your Spirit is faithful to minister to us. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Stanley, and thank you for doing this for the last couple of weeks and letting us be a part of your teaching. And, man, so many wonderful stories that we read about in the Bible, but the book of Daniel, one of my favorites, one of my favorite Bible characters, and just amazing. It's a lifetime of faithfulness with Daniel. It is a lifetime of faithfulness. And so thank you, Brother Stanley, for bringing those truths to light for us. And I hope all of you have a great rest of the day and safe journey home. And we hope to see you tomorrow afternoon if you're able to join us from 11:30 to 12:30. Have a good rest of the day. We'll see you.